If I were to ask you who you thought the oldest BMX company was, with the stipulation that the company has to have the original owner, who comes to mind? You've got Chris Moeller with S&M, there's Profile, a couple others, and then there is Supercross. This is a very small club of being in business for 30 plus years and not changing ownership. I call this company one of the most impressive, not because of their product offerings or how much revenue they make, but because of their grit, tenacity, and just the drive to not quit.
You know, here all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, BMX is going to be in the Olympics, and one of our riders, who was the current #1 girl pro, was going to go to the Olympics in Beijing on a Supercross. Oh my goodness. I mean, I remember the first day getting a packet from the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, with the guidelines of what we had to do.
This will probably be a multi-part video, but let's start with how Supercross even came into existence. How did they go from a drawing on a bedroom wall to being in the freaking Olympics? Well, all that started with a kid named Bill Ryan.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, Cam, how you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So if you do enjoy this content, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this video. All of that helps with the algorithm. One more thing. It is a work in progress, but at least it's up. By the age of 4, Bill had already caught the bicycle bug, starting with evenings riding with his grandfather, dealing with his parents' divorce, moving states. Riding his bicycle was his escape. He had a green Jimco Flying O. And you have to remember, this was right before the BMX bike actually started to gain traction. At this time, everyone was on a Stingray knockoff, just hoping that the bike held together long enough for one more ride. But this was Bill's escape. Riding every day after school gave him freedom. He was around 7 years old when he started riding his bike at The Pit, an abandoned trash dump that had been filled in that the local kids had built jumps on. And some of these local kids at The Pit were Donnie Jones, the Emmerich brothers, and none other than Scott Breithaupt. And long before these names gained recognition, they were letting Bill ride the jumps that they had made. They were older than Bill, and Bill looked up to these kids. They were the cool kids, and they were giving Bill the time of day.
It was just a fun time to just go and ride. And I still have the frame that Scott Breithaupt sold to me way back when, because he thought I was going to kill myself, because I kept breaking the Ashtabula forks, kept breaking the stems, kept breaking the bars. And
Bill's mother worked for Donnelly Publishing at the time, who just so happened to be producing a little magazine called Bicycle Motocross Action Magazine. Remember, this was before the BMX nomenclature was even around. But she thought Bill might like this magazine because it was kids on bikes. It's what he liked to do. So, Bill grabbed the magazine, started flipping through the pages, and he stopped when something caught his eye. Some of the kids in the magazine looked kind of familiar. To his amazement, a lot of the guys in the magazine were the older kids at the pit that Bill had been riding with every day. Bill went back to the pit and would just stare in awe at the older kids. It took him a few weeks before getting the courage to ask them about being in the magazine, and he was told all about the sport of BMX.
it really enamored me to where I didn't even know that the sport existed. I just thought it was just something that, every kid did. Once I finally got up the courage to actually talk to some of those guys and ask them, they're like, oh yeah, Bill, there's a track over here. We go race, and, race days are on Saturdays, or race days are on this day. And, I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. And of course, I showed up and found out you had to actually pay to race. That kind of burst my bubble a little bit, because I was being raised by a single mom who had 2 kids, and, the dad wasn't around, so there wasn't a lot of money.
And as Bill continued to ride, he continued to break his bike. I had a father tell me one time that his kid could break an anvil, and that's kind of what I imagined Bill doing at this time. Bill was around 12 at this point, and to help pay for the parts, Scott actually offered him a job working at SE after school. Sweeping floors, stickering frames, just grunt work. It was actually a 12-mile commute for him, which he claims doesn't sound like a lot, but at the time felt like it took forever. Well, Bill, I am here to tell you 12 miles on a BMX bike every single day isn't a short commute by any stretch of the imagination.
the little kid grunt that just was being given an opportunity. But I always kept bugging him, hey, I want to be on the team. I want to be on the team. And he was always, when you get a little bit better, And I always wanted a new bike. And I knew I couldn't afford one. And I used to take graph paper and put it up on my wall. And I would draw the frames life size on my wall. Say, okay, well, I like this frame. And I used to look at all the old Bob Harrow drawings he used to do of all the dimensions of the frames for all the bikes that they would test. I would do just full life-size scale ones up on my wall, and dreaming that one day I'll get to have a bike, or I'll get to buy a bike, or do something better than what I had.
So, being on the SE team was off the table, but Bill really wanted to be like his idols. He wrote and called other companies and got a co-sponsorship from none other than Torker, which we will get back to. His sponsorship was buying a frame at a discount and getting a support jersey, but that was enough to send him over the moon. But he had a problem. Remember the anvil analogy? Well, he did that to the Torker frames. The first couple times a frame cracked, Torker replaced it. But by the third time, they told Bill, sorry, we can't help you anymore. He had no real money to race, no real money to buy a new frame, no sponsorships, but Bill just wanted to keep riding.
There was a guy who lived down the street from me, Ray Elliott, who had a company called Certified Metal Products. He started taking my frame in when I would crack it and re-weld it for me. And after a couple of times of that, he finally said, hey, Bill, next time you're not at school during the week, meet me at my van, 6 a.m, bring your bike. And I didn't know what I was going to be getting myself into at that point. And I did. Met him over there. He took me into the shop and said, okay, take your bike apart. Here's how we're going to draw out your frame. Here's what we're going to do. And he let me start welding up my own frame. And I still have that frame.
So now, at 14 to 15 years old, Bill was learning how to weld BMX frames. He was getting pressured from some of his friends to start a company of his own.
It wasn't a plan for a business or anything. It was just so that I could have a bike that I could ride, something that I wasn't going to break. And one of my friends, Jimmy Foreman, back then convinced me. He's like, Bill, you should turn this into a bike company. We should do this. You should get a bike company. And we started the first 25 pieces of what was called high-tech racing back then.
BMX Plus magazine actually published a review of Bill's high-tech frame back in 1983. And little did Bill know, there was another company out there making BMX parts using the name High-Tech, and they immediately threatened to sue Bill. He didn't know really how to respond to the threat, so he just stopped making the frames. So now let's just take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. At 15 years old, Bill has already started his own frame company, albeit short-lived, got his product in a magazine, and has been threatened a lawsuit. He was still working at SE occasionally after school, and he was looking for a way to support himself in his racing habits. He had applied for a job with JMV Dresswear, which he ultimately didn't get, but he did ask, if I can't work for you, will you make me pants if I come up with my own design? JMV appropriately responded with, we will make anything as long as you can pay. And after dropping the high from high-tech, Tech BMX was formed.
Here I am working at SE, trying to sell a few tech racing pants on the side, trying to ride as much as I could. And then, of course, I'm there at SE the day that Rich Long and Gary Turner show up, and they buy all the equipment. And I had kind of known that things were going downhill over at SC. Debit had always had to go off to the bank every Fridays to get checks authorized because they were in bankruptcy. And, the building size had gotten cut down from being the full building to a half of the building to a quarter of the building. And SC shut down. Debit came in and gave me my last check and said, hey, Monday, here's the new address where you're going to start at. I thought that he was going to be moving SC or something. I mean, I was pretty naive about it at this point. I'm 16, 17 years old at that point, still not really understanding 100% about what's going on. And he had brokered my job over to GT after they had bought all the equipment. I remember riding up to GT my first morning, a little pissed off, a little cocky, a little arrogant, and, was riding up on my SE quad angle wearing a SC jersey with the sleeves cut off, and Gary Turner just looked at me and started laughing, and he's like, "Oh, we're going to get along just great." And I still had tech going on the side. I didn't tell them that because I was like, oh man, they've got Dyno, which was one of my major competitors at the time, and that wasn't getting paid a lot. So, I'd work all day long at GT, and then I'd go home and, hustle tech pants.
And ultimately, Tech BMX ended up becoming a pretty big brand. They made pants for Redline, Haro, Cyclecraft, S&M, Boss, Brackens, LNS, and had their own factory team that Bill put together.
That went on for a while. Rich Long and I never got along, and I got fired a few times, quit a few times, but it would always be a situation where Rich would call me back and say, "You cooled down? You ready to come back?" And I'd go back. And working at GT while it was growing back then, it was amazing. We went from the 1 building to 2 buildings to 3 buildings to 4 buildings to 5 buildings. And then they broke ground for the place in Gothard where it was going to be 120,000 square feet under one roof. And I was just like, oh man, this is crazy.
And during the growth of Tech, Bill's friend Tommy Brackens was dropped by GT as well as Bill's friend Kevin Hull. So Bill, starting to get a little chip on his shoulder in regards to GT and the way that they were treating his friends, he actually quit. He started working for Turnell Henry at his La Palma Cycle Center bike shop and helped Tommy build the first Brackens frames. As time went on, Tech continued to grow, and Bill started his own bike shop, Power Plus Cycles. And with his new shop, he continued the tradition that they had started at La Palma Cycle Center with gate starts right behind the shop.
We had a tradition to where we do gate starts behind the shop. It's where we had a little 2-man start gate, and there was a drag strip area behind the shop that was about 120 feet. One day a week, we'd get everybody together. We'd have Turnell and Tommy, and Pete Vonkarovich would show up, Eric Carter would show up, Billy Griggs, who was a great friend of mine that went to high school together. We actually ended up being roommates for a little while, would come by, and everybody's out there just doing gate starts. And with Tech, we had a pretty cool team. We had Brian Lopes and Glenn Pavlovsky and Billy Harrison. And
so one night at the start gate, watching the rear end of the frames flex and the chain sag, Bill came up with the idea for the Supercross secondary seat stay frame, the infamous Supercross 6-bar. You see, Bill had this great factory team, but couldn't get anyone to supply them with frames. Bill worked with Mike Devitt to help him relaunch SE, and Mike built Billy a long quad and Brian a long PK Ripper, but couldn't afford to just give them away. So Bill had frame designing on his mind once more. Not to create a company, as Tech was doing great, but for his riders to have bikes and to help them perform better. Supercross was built not to make money, but to keep the riders going. And so, during one of these gate sessions at the local BMX specific bike shop, the idea for Supercross was born.
Full send.
An idea to try and build a new company. It was just more or less I wanted to try and put our riders on products that would be good, that would help them. So it was like, okay, this is a pretty cool thing. We knew Tech was evolving and growing, and we had these great riders, but I was like, man, if I put a Tech name onto a frame, I'm going to lose my contract with Redline. I'm going to lose my contract with Haro. Again, it was just something to where we wanted to come up with a frame that I could put these riders under. And Billy Harrison and I had talked about it for probably 6 or 7 months about, well, what are we going to call it? What are we going to call it? How are we going to launch it? What are we going to call it? What are we going to do? We ended up coming up with the name Supercross because, what was BMX? BMX was an emulation of motocross. And what is the highest level of motocross racing? Well, Supercross. So let's call the frame the Supercross. The next day at the shop, Chris Moeller shows up with John Paul and Magoo. They walk in and they look down at the Supercross frame, that was built into a bike at this point. Chris looked at me and he's like, "You're going to do this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, man." I go, "We're going to do this." And I was jazzed. I was pumped. And he's like, "All right." He goes, "Well, just remember, when the elephants do battle, the ants get trampled." And he turned around and walked out. And I had no clue what he meant by that. The next day at the shop, when I showed up, all the S&M team pants that we had made for them with tech were on the front porch of the shop with all the S&M logos taken off. Oh, man. Now I know what he meant by that, to where I never thought that we were trying to do it to compete with anybody else in the industry. To me, in my eyes, when we were building it, we were just doing it because I wanted to try and put great riders on great bikes and solve what we thought was a problem out there. And obviously, some other people saw it as a competition type of thing. And luckily, Chris and I are great friends now. And I mean, he produces a bunch of stuff for us and we talk all the time. And, but that was 36 years ago. And, it was like, wow, okay, cool. I guess it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride.
So there gives you a little bit of backstory into Supercross. This is definitely going to be at least a 2-part video on this great brand. The reason I say this brand is so impressive is really because of Bill Ryan's start in the sport. He didn't have a dad like so many of these other companies that started that was, in a mechanic's shop or an aerospace engineer or some sort of welder that kind of showed him the ropes. And really pushed him to pursue his passion. He just loved the sport of BMX. BMX was his escape when he was a kid. He wasn't even some naturally gifted athlete when it comes to BMX, like so many of the companies that we research. But he loves the sport, and he found a way to do what he loves for the rest of his life, and that is extremely impressive.
BMX was pretty much the Wild West. He ended up crashing. His Troy Lee helmet exploded. He ended up in a coma. And there's been a lot of times where it would have been easier to hang it up and go a different direction. Why, Bill, when are you going to stop playing with those little kids' bikes and do something for real with your life? I always just keep looking at it and just going, well, this is real. This is something good.